Seal jokingly asked for the old veteran's rank, until his reply made the entire mess hall freeze. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It all started in a bustling mess hall at a United States Navy base, filled with the usual sounds of laughter, conversation, and the clatter of trays being moved around. Among the sea of sailors, one man sat alone at a table in the far corner. His face was weathered, with deep lines carved into his skin by years of life well lived. He wasn't much to look at, just an older man, in his late 80s, dressed in a faded blue shirt and worn-out pants. But there was something about his calm demeanor that set him apart from the rest. As the young sailors around him continued with their chatter, one particular SEAL, eager to impress his friends, decided to approach the old man. With a smirk on his face, the SEAL leaned down over the table and asked, "Hey Grandpa, what's your rank?" The room fell silent for a brief second, but the noise quickly returned as the sailors around him snickered. The old man didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the food in front of him, seemingly unfazed by the rude question. The SEAL, not satisfied with the silence, leaned in closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Seriously, what's your rank, old-timer?" he asked again, louder this time. His friends chuckled, egging him on. The old man finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes meeting the SEAL's gaze. His voice was calm, steady, and quiet as he replied, "My rank, it doesn't matter anymore." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The SEAL scoffed. "Yeah, I didn't think so. You're just another old guy living off past glory." The sailors around the table laughed, enjoying the show. The SEAL was clearly enjoying himself, but there was something different about the way the old man carried himself. He wasn't defensive, but his silence spoke volumes. As the mocking continued, the old man's eyes drifted to the side, and suddenly, a small pin on his shirt caught the light. It was an old, weathered badge, not much to look at. The SEAL noticed it and raised an eyebrow. "What's this? A little trinket from your glory days?" he asked, picking it up with a dismissive laugh. The old man didn't react, but as the SEAL held the pin, something shifted in the air. The sound of the mess hall seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the faint, distant noise of helicopters flying overhead, the rush of wind through the trees, and the faint smell of gunpowder. The SEAL's smile faltered as he suddenly realized that this pin wasn't just some meaningless trinket. The old man wasn't just any forgotten veteran. The room around him seemed to fade as the SEAL was taken back in time. The old man, younger now, was crouched behind a sandbag, the air thick with the smell of burning oil and gunpowder. He was a young soldier again, staring down the sights of a rifle, his heart beating steady and strong in his chest. The memories were sharp, like flashes of lightning, and in an instant, the SEAL knew. He wasn't in the presence of some random old man. He was in the presence of a legend. The old man, now back in the present, continued to sit quietly as the SEAL's bravado melted away. His words had landed, but the SEAL didn't understand the gravity of what was happening until it was too late. The young sailor, realizing his mistake, stood back, his smirk replaced by a look of genuine confusion. But before he could speak, the sound of military boots echoed in the distance. A group of officers, led by a senior officer, entered the mess hall, their sharp uniforms a stark contrast to the relaxed sailors around them. The officer, a decorated four-star general, immediately locked eyes with the old man. Without a word, he walked over, the room falling into an eerie silence. The SEAL's face turned pale as the general stopped in front of the old man and saluted him with respect. "It is an honor to meet you, Sergeant Major," the general said, his voice strong and respectful. The SEAL froze, his previous confidence now shattered. He had no idea who the old man truly was. The general turned to the sailors, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "This man is a hero," he said, his voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "He's earned more respect than any of you could possibly understand." The SEAL and his friends stood frozen, their mouths hanging open in disbelief as the general continued. This is the man who taught us what it means to fight for each other. The man who saved countless lives in places most of you will never even hear about. The room was completely still. The general's words hung heavy in the air as the truth of the old man's identity sank in. The seal, humbled and speechless, could do nothing but stand there as the old man, now revealed, simply nodded in acknowledgement. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will now continue the story in the same style and context you've requested, ensuring that it flows seamlessly from part 1 while adhering to the guidelines you've set. As the general's words echoed in the mess hall, the entire room stood still, their gazes fixed on the old man sitting at the table. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, with the sound of the general's salute still resonating like a thunderclap. The sailors, previously full of bravado and mocking laughter, now found themselves paralyzed in the presence of a living legend. The seal who had so confidently challenged the old man stood frozen, his face pale as the truth began to sink in. He had no idea who he was dealing with. His cocky demeanor, once fueled by youthful arrogance, had evaporated like smoke in the face of overwhelming reality. The general's sharp voice cut through the stillness once more. "Sergeant Major Martin Kelly," he continued, turning to address the entire room. "This man is not just a veteran. He is a hero, a man who served with honor, who faced impossible odds, and who sacrificed more than any of us can imagine." The words hung in the air like a shroud, wrapping themselves around the sailors who had so carelessly mocked him. They couldn't comprehend it, but they were about to learn. The general motioned to the old man, his eyes filled with respect. "You are in the presence of one of the most decorated veterans this country has ever known. Martin Kelly's name is etched into the annals of history, and his deeds are beyond anything you could ever dream of." There was a moment of stunned silence before the general's voice broke it again, this time softer, almost reverent. "Sergeant Major Kelly is the man who saved an entire battalion during the Battle of the Chosen Reservoir. He led his men through brutal conditions, never leaving a single soul behind. He's a man whose name will be remembered long after we are gone." The room, still in shock, began to shift. A few sailors exchanged nervous glances, some slowly starting to realize the gravity of the situation. The seal who had taunted the old man just moments before now stood with his head lowered, his face flushed with embarrassment. He couldn't hide from the truth anymore. The old man, once invisible in the crowd, now stood as the embodiment of courage and sacrifice. The general, his gaze unwavering, turned back to Martin Kelly. "You, Sergeant Major, represent the best of what we strive to be. You are the reason we are free, and it is an honor to stand in your presence." Martin Kelly, the veteran who had endured decades of hardships, finally allowed himself a small, quiet smile. It wasn't one of pride, but of quiet acknowledgement. He had never needed the medals or the recognition. The only thing that mattered to him was the lives he had saved, the men he had fought beside, and the promise he had made to them. The general took a step back, giving Martin space to rise from his seat. The entire mess hall watched in stunned silence as the old man slowly stood up, his back straight, his eyes clear and steady. He looked around at the young sailors, their eyes wide with awe and confusion. He had spent a lifetime being underestimated, but today, in this moment, they would learn that some things can't be measured by rank or uniform. Some things are earned in the quiet, unspoken moments of battle, in the sacrifices made for the greater good. Martin Kelly's reply, simple and humble as it was, had now become a powerful lesson to everyone present. The general stepped forward, placing a hand on Martin's shoulder. "You have nothing to prove to anyone, Sergeant Major," he said. "Your actions speak louder than any words could ever convey." And with that, the room was still. The old man, once invisible, had now become the embodiment of respect. The seal, once full of arrogance, stood at attention, his face reddened with shame. The sailors around him followed suit, standing silently as Martin Kelly, a hero in every sense of the word, walked out of the mess hall. The lesson had been learned, and it was one that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Some heroes don't wear capes. Some heroes don't need to say a word. They simply show up, and in doing so, they make the world a better place. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story in the same context, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. The mess hall was still. The heavy silence that had followed the general's words seemed to stretch on indefinitely. The young sailors, who had once filled the room with their laughter and mockery, now stood frozen, each one grappling with the weight of what had just happened. The SEAL who had mocked Martin Kelly earlier was no longer the confident young man he once was. His chest, once puffed out with pride, now sagged with a mixture of shame and awe. The rest of the sailors, all quiet, looked to one another, unsure of how to process the revelation that had just unfolded. Martin Kelly, the old man they had so thoughtlessly ridiculed, had become a living legend before their very eyes. As the general and his team left the mess hall, Martin stood for a moment, taking in the scene around him. The young sailors who had once looked at him with scorn now regarded him with deep respect, though none dared approach him. They knew, as they had been taught today, that some things could never be earned through rank or uniform. Some things were earned through blood, sacrifice, and the bonds of brotherhood forged in the fires of war. Martin turned to leave, his steps slow but deliberate. The general, having seen the respect he had earned from his brief encounter with the young men, approached him again. "Sergeant Major," the general began, his voice soft yet commanding, "I know this is a lot to take in for them. But today, you've taught them something more valuable than any lesson in combat." Martin gave a small nod. "Respect, sir," he said, his voice steady. "Respect is something that has to be earned." The general smiled, a rare, genuine smile that carried the weight of respect for the veteran. "You've earned it, Sergeant Major, and you've given them a lesson they won't soon forget." As the two men walked out of the mess hall, the air seemed to clear, and the sailors began to resume their conversations, though the mood was markedly different. There was no longer any laughter or mocking. Instead, there was a quiet reverence, an unspoken understanding that they had witnessed something profound. Meanwhile, in the distance, the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air signaled the arrival of another part of the base's leadership. The commanding officers, having heard of the incident, were making their way to the mess hall, their arrival causing the young sailors to shift uneasily. They knew that what had happened in the mess hall was no longer just a lesson for them. It was a lesson for everyone who had witnessed the transformation of the old man into a hero. As the commanders arrived, they were greeted with a hushed silence. The SEAL who had mocked Martin Kelly earlier stood to the side, his hands folded in front of him, eyes downcast. He couldn't bring himself to look anyone in the eye. The others, too, remained quiet, unsure of what to say or do in the presence of so much unspoken history. The commanding officers surveyed the room, sensing the change in the atmosphere. General Thompson, still holding his calm, took a deep breath. "What happened here today," he said, his voice firm and commanding, "is not just about respect for one man. It's about respect for all of you, for the sacrifices that have been made, and for the lessons that come from those who have walked the hardest paths before us." The young sailors stood at attention, the weight of the words sinking in. They had been given an opportunity to learn, not just from their superiors, but from the man who had served his country with quiet dignity, never asking for recognition, but receiving it nonetheless. In the days that followed, there were no more jokes or mockery in the mess hall. The young sailors, though still inexperienced, carried with them the lesson they had learned that day. Respect was not something given freely. It was something earned, through actions, through sacrifice, and through the integrity that comes from standing for what is right. And as for Martin Kelly, he continued on, not looking for accolades but knowing that the respect he had earned was not just for him, but for every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who had ever given their all for their country. As he made his way back to his quarters, he couldn't help but think about the men and women who had fought beside him, the ones who had never made it back. They were the ones who truly deserved the recognition. He was just doing what any of them would have done. But in the eyes of the young sailors, Martin Kelly had become more than just a man. He had become a symbol of honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of respect. And that was a legacy he could be proud of. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. The next few days at the Navy base were marked by an unusual atmosphere. The once carefree mess hall, where the young sailors had often joked and mocked the older veterans, had changed completely. There was no longer any laughter at the expense of the elderly. The lesson they had learned from Sergeant Major Martin Kelly was too powerful to be ignored. It wasn't just the young SEAL who had learned a valuable lesson that day. The entire base had shifted. Everywhere you looked, sailors moved with a sense of quiet respect, heads slightly lowered, as if carrying a newfound understanding of what it meant to truly serve. It was a respect earned not by rank, but by actions, by sacrifice, and by the courage to do what was right when no one was looking. But for Martin Kelly, the transformation in the mess hall was just another chapter in his life's journey. He had seen far worse in his time. He had fought in wars, witnessed horrors, and made choices no man should ever have to make. But through it all, he had always kept his dignity intact. He never sought recognition for his deeds. The things he had done, the lives he had saved, were not for medals or accolades. They were for the men and women beside him, the ones who depended on him to keep going when the world around them fell apart. Now, as he walked through the base, the sailors and officers who passed him gave him a respectful nod, acknowledging his presence without saying a word. It was as if they could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. As he reached the base's main headquarters, he was stopped by a young lieutenant, who looked both nervous and hesitant. "Sergeant Major," the lieutenant said, his voice uncertain. "The general wants to speak with you. He's in his office." Martin nodded, though he wasn't sure what the general could possibly want with him. He had already received his share of attention. "Lead the way, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice as steady as ever. The lieutenant guided him through the corridors, and as they reached the general's office, Martin's thoughts wandered. What did the general want with him now? Had he made his point in the mess hall? Or was there something else he needed to prove? The door to the office opened, and the lieutenant stepped aside, allowing Martin to enter. Inside, General Thompson was seated behind a large oak desk, his face serious but welcoming. "Sergeant Major," the general said, rising to his feet. "Please have a seat." Martin took a seat in front of the desk, his posture upright and respectful. "I trust everything is going well, sir?" he asked, his voice calm. The general didn't immediately respond. Instead, he walked around the desk, standing beside Martin. "I've been hearing some interesting things about you, Sergeant Major," the general said. "I hear you've made quite the impression on the men here." Martin said nothing, though he could feel the general's eyes on him. "I don't seek attention, sir," he finally replied. "I only did what needed to be done." The general smiled slightly, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "That's what I admire about you," he said. "You're humble. You've earned respect without ever asking for it." The general paused, as if contemplating something. "But it's not just your actions I want to discuss. It's your legacy." Martin's eyes narrowed slightly. "My legacy, sir?" he asked. The general nodded. "You've made an impact here, Sergeant Major. Your story is one that needs to be heard. Not just by us, but by the entire Navy. Your experience, your courage, it's something that can inspire the next generation of sailors. You've earned the right to be a mentor to them." Martin was taken aback by the general's words. He had never thought of himself as someone to mentor others. His only goal had been to survive, to keep going, and to protect his comrades. "I'm just a soldier, sir," he said softly. "Nothing more, nothing less." The general looked down at him, his expression serious. "You've done more than that. You've done what so many can't. And now, it's time to share your story, to let the next generation know what it truly means to serve." Martin sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the general's words sinking in. He had never thought of himself as a role model. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was what he had been meant to do all along. He had survived, not for recognition, but for something greater. Perhaps now, he could pass on the lessons he had learned to those who would follow in his footsteps. The general gave him a moment to reflect before speaking again. "I'm putting you forward for a special mission, Sergeant Major," the general said, his voice firm. "Not on the battlefield, but here. I want you to be part of our mentorship program, to help shape the future of our Navy." Martin thought about it for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll do whatever is needed, sir," he replied. The general's smile returned, wider this time. "I knew you would. You've earned your place here, Sergeant Major. Now, it's time to show the world what true honor looks like." As Martin left the general's office, the weight of his new role settled on his shoulders. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a teacher, a guide, and most importantly, a symbol of what it meant to serve with dignity and honor. The Navy had always been about more than just the men and women who wore its uniform. It was about the legacy they left behind, the stories they shared, and the respect they earned. And now, It was Martin's turn to pass that legacy on. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Sergeant Major Martin Kelly. After the general's invitation to join the mentorship program, the veteran found himself in the midst of something he had never expected. Not just recognition, but the responsibility of shaping the future of the Navy. He had spent his life fighting in the shadows, away from the spotlight, and now, he was expected to take on a new role as a guide for the young sailors and soldiers coming up behind him. At first, Martin was hesitant. He had never thought of himself as a teacher. He had always been the one following orders, carrying out his mission, and keeping his head down. The idea of mentoring young men and women felt like an entirely different battle, a battle that required patience and a completely different kind of strength. But as he stood in front of the first group of recruits assigned to him, his doubts began to fade. They were young, eager, and full of questions that Martin had the answers to, not because he had read them in a manual, but because he had lived them. He started each session the same way, telling them the truth. I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. I'm here to tell you what you need to hear. Some of them didn't understand at first. They had expected stories of glory, tales of heroism, and battles fought with valor. But Martin didn't offer them that. Instead, he spoke about the real challenges, the long hours, the sacrifices, the exhaustion, and the loneliness that came with service. He shared stories of comrades lost, of moments when victory seemed impossible, and of the times when giving up seemed like the only option. There's a reason why we keep going, even when everything inside us tells us to stop, he told them one afternoon, his voice steady and low. It's not about the rank or the medals. It's about the people next to you. It's about being there for them when they can't be there for themselves. The recruits, some of whom had expected to hear only tales of combat, began to see the truth in his words. Martin wasn't just a teacher of tactics and drills. He was teaching them about the heart of service. He wasn't teaching them to be warriors. He was teaching them to be better people. As the weeks passed, Martin's influence began to show. The young sailors who had once viewed the Navy as nothing more than a job, an opportunity for adventure or financial stability, began to understand what it truly meant to be a part of something greater than themselves. They started to embrace the idea that their service wasn't just about them. It was about everyone they served with, everyone they were fighting for. They were learning from a man who had lived it all, who had fought the toughest battles, not just on foreign soil, but in the quiet moments when no one was looking. He had taught them to respect not just the Navy but the people within it. But as much as Martin had impacted them, they had also changed him. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't realized he had been missing, a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. In a way, mentoring gave him a new mission, one that was even more important than any he had ever had before. It was no longer about fighting for his own life. It was about ensuring that the future of the Navy was in capable hands. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling training session, Martin found himself walking through the base, reflecting on everything that had happened. The weight of his new role had begun to settle into his bones, but he didn't mind it. It was different from any mission he had been on before, but it was just as important. As he walked, he noticed a group of young sailors gathered around, laughing and talking. A few of them waved as they saw him approaching. He waved back, a small smile crossing his face. He had never been one for camaraderie in the traditional sense, but now, it felt natural. He was no longer the solitary figure he had been all those years. He was part of something bigger, a force that was shaping the next generation of sailors, just as he had been shaped so many years ago. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sergeant Major, you've got a visitor," a young airman called out to him. Martin turned and saw a figure walking toward him, General Thompson. The general, always calm and collected, had a slight smile on his face as he approached. "Sergeant Major, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you," the general said, his voice sincere. "You've done more in the last few weeks than most men do in a lifetime. The changes you've brought about here are already visible. I'm proud of what you're doing for these young sailors." Martin nodded, though he didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to receiving compliments. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he replied. The general chuckled softly. "You've always been humble, Sergeant Major. But I can see that you found your new mission, and I couldn't be prouder to have you leading it." The general paused, looking out at the young sailors who were still gathered nearby, training, laughing, and talking. "You've earned your place in history, Sergeant Major. But more importantly, you're earning their respect. That's something that will last long after we're gone." Martin looked out at the sailors, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't expected. He was making a difference, not just with his words, but with his actions. And in that moment, he realized that this was the legacy he had been meant to leave behind. The mission he had been waiting for all his life was right here, in front of him, and he was finally ready to embrace it. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a mentor, a guide, and a symbol of the true meaning of service. And that was something that would last far longer than any medal he had ever received. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. Weeks passed, and Martin Kelly found himself growing more comfortable in his new role. What had initially felt like an overwhelming responsibility now felt like a second life for him. He had spent decades serving his country, but it was in these quieter moments, mentoring the next generation of sailors, that he truly understood the impact of his legacy. He watched as the young recruits, many of whom had been skeptical at first, began to take his lessons to heart. They weren't just learning about military tactics and survival skills anymore. They were learning about character, about honor, and about what it truly meant to serve something greater than themselves. Martin had never been the kind of man who sought attention. His whole life had been a testament to humility and duty. Yet, there was something different now. He was making a difference. He wasn't just one man on a battlefield anymore. He was a force shaping the future of the Navy, one sailor at a time. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, reviewing training reports, he was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," Martin called. The door opened, and a young sailor stepped inside, holding a letter in his hand. "Sergeant Major Kelly, this just came for you," the sailor said, handing the letter over. Martin took the envelope, his name neatly printed on the front. He didn't recognize the handwriting. Opening it, he unfolded the letter inside. As he read, his eyes narrowed, and for the first time in a long while, a sense of unease settled in his chest. The letter was from a government office, requesting his presence at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. The letter made it clear that he was being recognized for his service, his unparalleled contributions during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, and his decades of dedication to his country. At first, Martin was reluctant. He had never been one for ceremonies or public recognition. The only thing that mattered to him was the men and women he had served with, the brothers and sisters he had fought beside, and the lives he had saved. But as he reread the letter, he realized that perhaps this wasn't just about him. It was about the stories of all the men and women who had fought alongside him, all the soldiers who had never been given the recognition they deserved. Perhaps, in some small way, accepting this recognition would honor them too. "Sir," the young sailor said, breaking Martin's thoughts, "are you going to attend?" Martin looked up at the sailor and nodded slowly. "I'll be going," he said, his voice steady. "But not for me. For them." The sailor gave a brief salute before leaving, and Martin sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Over the next few days, preparations were made for his trip to Washington, D.C. It was a strange feeling for him. He had never been one for attention, and the thought of stepping into the spotlight felt foreign. But as he packed his bags, a part of him knew that this was a moment that could not be ignored. He would stand in front of the nation not just as a soldier, but as a representative of all the veterans who had ever served their country with honor. When the day arrived, Martin made his way to the airport. The journey to Washington was long, but his mind was focused on one thing: the ceremony. He had no intention of making a speech or drawing attention to himself. He would simply stand there, honor the service of those who had come before him, and let his actions speak for themselves. When he arrived at the ceremony, he was greeted by dignitaries, generals, and officers from all branches of the military. But it wasn't the high-ranking officials that caught his attention, it was the veterans. The men and women who had fought in wars, who had faced unimaginable hardships, and who, like him, had never asked for anything in return. As he stood in front of the crowd, the feeling of recognition was overwhelming. For a moment, Martin felt out of place. These were the people he had fought beside, and he had never felt the need for accolades. But as the ceremony began, and the stories of bravery and sacrifice were shared, Martin realized that this moment wasn't just for him. It was for all of them. It was for the veterans who had served quietly, who had carried the weight of war without complaint, and who had never sought recognition. The ceremony ended with a standing ovation. Martin stood there, humbled, as the applause filled the room. He didn't raise his hand to wave or acknowledge the crowd. He simply stood there, a quiet figure among the many, knowing that he had done his part. As he left the ceremony that day, a young officer approached him. "Sergeant Major," the officer said, "your story, your service, has inspired all of us. You've shown us what true honor looks like." Martin gave the officer a simple nod, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I didn't do it for recognition," Martin replied. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." And with that, he walked away, his legacy quietly etched into the fabric of the Navy. The ceremony had been an honor, but for Martin Kelly, the real work was still ahead of him. He would continue to serve, not in the way he had in the past, but in a new role, one that would shape the next generation of sailors and soldiers. And as he walked out of the hall, he knew that his story would live on, not in the medals or the awards, but in the lives of those he had taught, guided, and inspired. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. Weeks had passed since the ceremony in Washington, and Martin Kelly had settled back into his role as a mentor at the Navy base. His name had become known to a wider audience, but the recognition hadn't changed him. He still moved through the halls of the base with the same quiet dignity he had always carried. He was no longer the unknown veteran in the corner of the mess hall, ignored by the young sailors. Now, they sought his advice, his wisdom, and his guidance. It was a strange feeling for Martin, but it was a feeling he had come to accept. The impact of his actions had rippled through the Navy, and the respect he had earned had opened doors for him to reach even more young men and women. He spent his days teaching them not just about tactics, not just about the technical skills they needed to survive on the battlefield, but about the things that couldn't be taught in a manual. He taught them about leadership, about the importance of honor, and about the bonds of brotherhood that were formed in the toughest of times. As much as he had dreaded the spotlight, Martin knew he had found a new purpose. But as his influence grew, so did the challenges. Not everyone was happy with the changes he was bringing. There were still those on the base who saw Martin's approach as old-fashioned, who believed that the modern military didn't need to focus so much on character and respect. They believed that the Navy's new generation of sailors needed to be more aggressive, more competitive. One afternoon, as Martin was preparing for his next session with a group of young recruits, he was approached by Captain Daniels, a young officer who had risen through the ranks quickly and believed in a more traditional, strict approach to leadership. "Sergeant Major," Captain Daniels began, his tone respectful but firm, "I've heard a lot about the work you've been doing with the recruits. I appreciate your dedication, but I think we need to focus more on getting results, not on all these life lessons you've been teaching." Martin looked at the captain for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Captain, you can teach a sailor how to fire a weapon, how to repair a ship, but if you don't teach them what it means to stand by their comrades, to lead with integrity, then what's the point of all that training?" The captain didn't respond immediately, but the challenge in Martin's voice was clear. "I'm not saying we should ignore training," Martin continued, his voice steady. "But the Navy is about more than just the mission. It's about the people. You can't train a soldier to be a leader unless you teach them to lead by example, to make the tough choices when no one is watching." Captain Daniels paused, considering his words carefully. "I understand that, Sergeant Major. But the world is changing. We need to adapt to the new reality. There's no time for what you're teaching. We need soldiers who can win, fast and decisively." Martin nodded, but he wasn't about to back down. "You're right. The world is changing. But that doesn't mean the core values of honor, courage, and commitment should change. If anything, the need for those values is more important now than ever. What good is a soldier who wins battles if he's forgotten what it means to fight for something greater than himself?" The captain's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue further. He understood that this was a battle he wasn't going to win. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Martin to reflect on their conversation. Later that day, as Martin prepared for his next session with the recruits, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Navy was at a crossroads. There were some, like Captain Daniels, who believed that results were all that mattered. But Martin knew the truth. The real strength of the military didn't come from power alone. It came from the integrity of the individuals who made up its ranks. The recruits were waiting for him in the training room, and as he entered, he was greeted with the usual mix of curiosity and respect. They had come to look up to him not just as a mentor, but as someone who had lived through the very experiences they would one day face. "All right, everyone," Martin said, his voice calm yet commanding. "Today, we're going to talk about leadership. The kind of leadership that's earned, not given. The kind that doesn't just come from the top down, but from within. The kind that's built on trust and respect, not fear." As he spoke, Martin felt the weight of his words. He knew that the future of the Navy didn't just lie in the hands of the officers and commanders. It lay in the hands of the men and women who would one day follow them. He had been given a unique opportunity to shape that future, and he would do whatever it took to make sure the next generation of sailors understood the true meaning of leadership. After the session, as the recruits filed out of the room, Martin felt a sense of pride. They were listening. They were learning. And in the back of his mind, he knew that this was the real mission, shaping these young men and women into leaders who would carry the Navy's values forward into the future. The battle for the soul of the military was far from over. But as long as men like Martin Kelly were around to teach the next generation, the Navy would never forget what it truly meant to serve. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. As the months passed, Sergeant Major Martin Kelly's influence continued to grow at the base. His mentorship program had become a cornerstone of the Navy's training, and the recruits who came under his guidance were not just learning military tactics. They were learning about leadership, integrity, and the strength that comes from within. Martin had always believed that leadership wasn't just about commanding respect, it was about earning it. The young sailors, who had once been full of youthful bravado, now began to understand the true meaning of service. They weren't just here to fight battles. They were here to stand by their comrades, to put the mission first, and to never compromise on their values. It wasn't an easy lesson, and it wasn't one that could be learned overnight. But Martin knew that it was the most important lesson of all. One afternoon, Martin was walking through the base when he was stopped by a familiar face. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Winters, a young officer who had been on the base for just a few months, approached him with a serious expression. "Sergeant Major, I need to speak with you," she said, her tone urgent. Martin stopped and looked at her. "What's going on, Commander?" he asked. Sarah glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then lowered her voice. "There's been a situation in one of the units. A group of sailors who were under your mentorship, they've been acting out. They've been showing up late to training, skipping meals, and ignoring orders. I've spoken with them, but it's not getting through. I'm worried they might be losing focus." Martin's brow furrowed. He had always believed that a soldier's actions spoke louder than their words, and the idea that the recruits under his watch were faltering was deeply troubling to him. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice firm. The two of them walked together to the training area, where the group of young sailors were gathered. They were sitting on the grass, chatting amongst themselves, their training gear scattered around them. When they saw Martin approaching, they stood up, their expressions shifting from casual to tense. Martin didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, observing them, letting the silence build. Finally, one of the sailors, a young man named Private First Class Jameson, spoke up. "Sergeant Major," he began, "we've been having a tough time lately. Things just haven't been going well, and we're kind of lost." The others nodded in agreement, their eyes downcast. Martin's gaze softened, but his voice remained steady. "I get it," he said. "You're struggling. You think the mission is too hard, that the training is too intense. But let me tell you something. You're not the first to feel this way, and you won't be the last." The recruits looked up at him, their expressions unsure. Martin took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been where you are. I've faced challenges that would have broken most men. I've seen brothers fall beside me, never to rise again. I've faced fears so deep that it felt like it would swallow me whole. But here's the thing. You don't get through those moments alone. You get through them because of the people beside you, and because you refuse to give up." There was a pause as Martin's words sank in. The recruits were silent, absorbing the weight of his experience. "You see," he continued, "you're not just soldiers. You're part of a team. And when one of you falters, we all falter. But when one of you rises, we all rise. You have a choice now. You can keep down the path you're on, but that path leads to failure. Or you can choose to stand up, to fight, and to be the leaders you were meant to be. Private First Class Jameson looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But Sergeant Major, he said, his voice hesitant, we're not sure we can do it. What if we can't live up to the expectations? Martin's expression softened. The truth is, no one is born ready for this. No one comes out of the womb a hero. We're all made through our choices, through the battles we face and the lessons we learn. And believe me, the hardest battles are the ones you fight within yourself. So stop thinking you can't. Stop thinking you're not good enough. You are. You just have to believe it. There was a long silence as the group of recruits processed his words. Then, one by one, they began to straighten up, their shoulders pulling back, their postures firming. Jameson was the first to speak again. We're ready, Sergeant Major, he said, his voice more confident than it had been before. Martin nodded. Good. Then let's get back to work. The group of sailors fell into line, their energy renewed, their focus sharp. Martin watched them as they moved through their drills, their movements more purposeful, more deliberate. He knew that they weren't just following orders. They were beginning to understand what it meant to lead with integrity, to fight not just for the mission, but for each other. As the day wore on, Martin couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. These young sailors were learning, and they were growing. They were still rough around the edges, still figuring things out, but they were on the right path. And that was all he could ask for. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, Martin felt like the Navy was moving in the right direction. The legacy he had fought so hard to build wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. And that was the most important thing of all. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. The weeks that followed were some of the busiest Martin Kelly had ever experienced. The new recruits were showing significant improvement, and the base had begun to see the results of his mentorship program. He had never imagined that his quiet days as a soldier would lead him to this point. Yet, here he was, shaping the next generation of Navy sailors, teaching them more than just how to fight, but how to live with honor, integrity, and respect. He had not anticipated the impact this would have, not just on the young sailors, but on himself as well. For the first time in a long time, Martin felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Navy was no longer just a place of duty for him. It was a place where he could make a difference. It was a place where he could teach the values he had fought for, not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life. But with success came challenges. The success of his mentorship program had caught the attention of high-ranking officials, and soon Martin found himself invited to speak at conferences and meetings, sharing his insights and approach. He had never been one for the spotlight, and the idea of addressing large groups of people made him uncomfortable. But as time went on, he realized that this was just another opportunity to make a difference. One morning, after a particularly long day of training and meetings, Martin sat alone in his office. He was looking over reports when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, not looking up from his work. The door opened slowly, and to his surprise, it was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Winters who stepped inside. Sarah had been a constant presence at the base since Martin's arrival, always helping him with logistics and organizing the recruits. She had grown to be someone Martin respected deeply, not just as a colleague, but as a leader. "Sergeant Major," she said, closing the door behind her. "I need to speak with you. It's about the recruits." Martin looked up from his desk, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's going on?" he asked, concerned. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "There's a new assignment coming in. They're bringing in a special task force to assess the recruits and see if they're ready for the next level of training. It's going to be intense, and I'm afraid some of them might not be prepared." Martin's brow furrowed. "What kind of task force?" he asked. "It's a group of Navy SEALs," she replied. "They're coming in to evaluate our top recruits and see how they hold up under extreme conditions. They'll push them harder than anything we've done so far. I'm worried some of them won't make it." Martin sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew that this kind of evaluation could be brutal. The SEALs were some of the best in the world, and their training was known for its intensity. But he also knew that it could be exactly what some of the recruits needed. They needed to be tested to see if they could handle the pressure, the stress, the sacrifices that came with the job. He looked up at Sarah. "Are you worried about the recruits?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. I'm worried about them not being ready. But I know they've come a long way under your leadership, Sergeant Major. They're stronger than they think, but they need to be pushed to see just how far they can go. Martin nodded slowly. I understand, but they'll need more than just the usual training. If we want them to succeed, we need to prepare them for the hardest challenge of their lives. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the base. He thought back to his own time in the service, the challenges he had faced, and the men and women who had helped him through it all. He thought of the battles he had fought, not just on the battlefield, but within himself. It was time to prepare these recruits for their own battles. We'll prepare them, Sarah, he said, turning back to her. We'll push them. We'll make them stronger. And when those SEALs arrive, they'll see what true strength looks like. Sarah smiled, relief flooding her face. Thank you, Sergeant Major, she said. I knew I could count on you. Over the next few days, Martin and Sarah worked tirelessly to prepare the recruits for the upcoming evaluation. They pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed before. The training was grueling, and the recruits were tested physically, mentally, and emotionally. But as the days passed, Martin could see the difference in them. They were growing stronger, more confident, and more capable. They were no longer just soldiers going through the motions. They were becoming leaders. They were becoming warriors. When the day of the evaluation finally arrived, the recruits lined up in the training yard, waiting for the task force to arrive. Martin stood at the front, his eyes scanning the group. He had seen them at their best and their worst, but today was the day that would define them. The SEALs arrived shortly after, their presence commanding the attention of everyone in the yard. Martin stepped forward and addressed the recruits. Today is the day you'll be tested, he said, his voice steady and calm. You've come a long way, and now it's time to see if you have what it takes. This will not be easy, but I know you're ready. So show them what you've got. Show them who you are. As the SEALs began their evaluation, Martin watched with a sense of pride. He had pushed these young men and women to their limits, and now it was their turn to rise to the occasion. He knew that no matter what happened, they had already proven themselves. This was their moment. And for Martin, that was all that mattered. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. The day of the SEAL evaluation arrived, and the atmosphere on the base was charged with anticipation. The recruits lined up in formation, their expressions a mix of determination and uncertainty. They had come a long way under Martin Kelly's mentorship, but this would be the true test of everything they had learned. As the SEALs, a formidable group of highly trained soldiers, took their positions, Martin stood at the edge of the training yard, observing his recruits. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had seen what these young men and women were capable of, but this was different. The SEALs were the best of the best, and they weren't here to offer praise. They were here to push the recruits to their limits, to see who could rise to the challenge and who would falter under pressure. Martin knew that this would be a turning point for many of them. He had prepared them for this day, but now it was up to the recruits to prove they were ready for what lay ahead. As the SEALs began their evaluation, the recruits were immediately thrust into a series of intense physical challenges. The first was a grueling obstacle course, designed to test their endurance, strength, and agility. The recruits sprinted through mud, scaled walls, crawled through narrow tunnels, and climbed ropes, all while the SEALs watched closely, offering no words of encouragement. The young sailors pushed themselves, their bodies screaming in pain, but they kept going, determined not to let their fellow recruits down. Martin's eyes scanned the group, and he felt a deep sense of pride. These recruits were no longer the uncertain, untested sailors they had been when they first arrived. They were becoming soldiers, leaders, ready to face whatever the world threw at them. As the obstacle course came to an end, the recruits were immediately thrown into a series of combat drills. They faced mock firefights, forced to work as teams, using their training to clear buildings, neutralize threats, and respond to simulated ambushes. The intensity of the drills was overwhelming, but Martin could see the difference in the way the recruits handled the pressure. They weren't just reacting. They were thinking, making decisions, and leading each other. As the day wore on, the recruits began to show signs of fatigue, their faces covered in sweat, their muscles aching from the constant physical strain. But they didn't stop. They didn't quit. Martin had instilled in them the importance of perseverance, and now they were putting that lesson into practice. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about mental toughness. The SEALs, who had been quiet observers up until this point, began to take notice. The first signs of respect started to emerge. One of the SEALs, a tall, muscular man named Gunnery Sergeant Daniels, looked over at Martin as they watched the recruits finish a particularly difficult drill. "You've done something here, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice low. Martin didn't reply immediately, his eyes fixed on the recruits. "They've got grit," he said finally. "They're not just following orders. They're thinking for themselves. They're learning how to lead." Gunnery Sergeant Daniels nodded. "I've seen some of them push through things I didn't think they could. That's impressive." The evaluation continued late into the afternoon, with the recruits facing even more intense scenarios. They were exhausted, their bodies battered, but they were determined to prove themselves. As the final exercise approached, a high-stakes scenario that required all the skills they had learned, Martin stood at the side of the field, his heart pounding. He had no doubt that they could do it. He had seen them grow, seen them struggle, and seen them overcome their doubts. But there was something about this final test that made it different. It wasn't just about passing the test. It was about showing that they were ready for anything, that they had the strength to face the toughest challenges and the heart to never give up. The recruits were split into teams and assigned different objectives. They were sent into the simulated battlefield, where they would have to navigate obstacles, engage in combat situations, and protect their teammates. The SEALs would be observing, offering no help, only silently judging their actions. Martin watched as the teams moved out, their faces set with determination. This was it, the final test. The recruits moved with purpose, their training kicking in as they advanced through the simulated field. They cleared rooms, covered each other's backs, and fought through the chaos. Martin couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in his chest. These recruits were not the same young men and women who had arrived months ago. They were warriors. They were leaders. And no matter what happened today, they had proven something. Something that went far beyond just completing an obstacle course or passing a physical test. They had proven that they could be counted on when it mattered most. As the exercise came to a close, Martin walked over to the group of recruits, who were catching their breath and wiping the sweat from their faces. They stood at attention as he approached, but there was no need for the formality. They had already earned his respect. "You did it," Martin said, his voice steady but filled with pride. "You've earned your place here. You've earned the right to be called sailors. You've proven that you have the heart, the mind, and the strength to be leaders. And I couldn't be prouder of you." The recruits stood silently, absorbing his words. They had faced the toughest evaluation of their lives, and they had risen to the occasion. They had proven to themselves, and to Martin, that they were ready for whatever came next. As the SEALs gathered around, Gunnery Sergeant Daniels stepped forward, a rare smile on his face. "Sergeant Major," he said, "I have to admit, I didn't think they had it in them. But they proved me wrong." Martin nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "They always had it in them," he said. "They just needed the chance to show it." And with that, Martin knew that his work here was done. The recruits had proven themselves. They were ready. And as they prepared to move on to the next phase of their training, Martin couldn't help but feel that he had played a small part in shaping their future. The Navy's future. The future of the men and women who would carry its legacy forward. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. The results of the SEAL evaluation had left a lasting impact on everyone at the base. The recruits, now fully aware of their own potential, stood with newfound pride. They had proven themselves capable, not just of enduring the physical challenges, but of rising to the occasion when their leadership was tested. Martin Kelly watched them, his heart swelling with pride. They had done it. They had become the warriors he always knew they could be. But as the dust settled, the reality of the mission ahead began to take hold. The training was far from over. This was only the beginning. Martin knew that despite their success in the evaluation, there was still much more they had to learn. It was one thing to face an obstacle course or a mock battle, but it was something entirely different to be thrust into the chaos of a real mission. And with the way the world was changing, with tensions rising around the globe, the recruits needed to be prepared for anything. They needed to be ready for the unpredictable. As the weeks went on, Martin continued his mentorship, pushing the recruits harder, making sure they knew that the lessons they had learned would be tested in real-life situations. One afternoon, as he was walking through the base, his phone rang. It was a call from General Thompson. "Sergeant Major Kelly," the general said, his voice steady but serious. "We've just received new orders. There's a deployment scheduled, and we need your recruits to be ready. The mission is critical. It's time to put everything they've learned to the test." Martin's mind raced as he processed the information. The recruits had done well, but nothing could truly prepare them for the realities of war. This was no longer just training. This was real. "Understood, sir," Martin replied, his voice firm. "We'll have them ready." As the phone call ended, Martin stood still for a moment, the weight of the upcoming mission settling over him. He turned and walked back to the training area, where the recruits were awaiting their next challenge. He had never been one to sugarcoat the truth, and now was no different. As he arrived, he saw the recruits, their faces eager and ready. They had no idea what was coming, but Martin did. They needed to be prepared, not just physically, but mentally. He had to prepare them for the possibility that not all of them would make it back. "All right, everyone," Martin said, his voice carrying across the yard. "We've been training hard, but now it's time for something real. We've got a deployment coming up. You're going to face things you've never imagined. You're going to be tested in ways you never thought possible. This is no longer just about drills. This is about survival." The recruits looked at him, their faces a mix of determination and uncertainty. "You've learned everything you need to know," Martin continued. "You've learned how to lead, how to fight, and how to work as a team. But now, you're going to put that knowledge to the test. We're about to step into the real world. And in that world, there's no room for hesitation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You've trained for this. You've trained to fight for your brothers and sisters. You've trained to fight for what's right. And when the time comes, you will rise to the occasion. You will prove that you have the heart, the strength, and the courage to do whatever it takes." The recruits stood taller, their resolve firming. Martin could see the shift in them. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were warriors, ready to face whatever came next. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. The recruits went through final drills, packing their gear and running through scenarios that were as close to the real thing as possible. Martin was there every step of the way, offering advice, encouragement, and, when necessary, discipline. He knew this deployment would be unlike anything they had faced. There would be no safety net, no easy outs. They would be on the front lines, and there was no telling what they would encounter. But he was confident in them. They had proven themselves time and again. They had shown the resilience, the strength, and the heart of true warriors. As the day of the deployment arrived, the recruits gathered in formation, ready to board the transport that would take them to their mission. Martin stood at the front, watching them one last time. He saw the fire in their eyes, the same fire that had burned in him when he was their age. He knew they were ready. As the transport took off, Martin sat in silence, reflecting on the journey he had taken with these young men and women. They had come so far, and now it was their turn to show the world what they were made of. He had done his part. Now, it was up to them to finish the mission. The mission would be tough. It would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. But Martin knew they were ready. They were warriors, after all. And no matter what happened, they would rise to the occasion. This was their time. As the transport rumbled through the skies, heading toward the unknown, Martin Kelly's heart swelled with pride. He had spent his life serving his country, and now, he was watching the next generation take their place. They were ready for anything. And with that, Martin knew that the future of the Navy was in good hands. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. The deployment had been swift, and the atmosphere aboard the transport was tense. Martin Kelly sat in silence, his eyes scanning the recruits. They were ready. He could feel it. But there was something about this mission that had a weight to it, a sense of finality that hung in the air. He had seen enough action in his life to know when a mission was going to push them to their absolute limits. And this one, he knew, would do just that. The flight was long, the hum of the engines a constant presence that did little to ease the growing tension. Some of the recruits were trying to rest, but most sat upright, their eyes sharp, their minds focused on the unknown ahead. Martin had always been one to keep his mind clear in moments like this. He didn't need the distractions. He focused on the mission, on what was coming, and on the men and women who depended on him. As the transport neared the drop zone, the tension in the cabin increased. Martin stood and walked to the front, checking the gear and making sure the recruits were ready for whatever lay ahead. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the cabin. "We've trained for this. You've trained for this. You've earned your place here, and now it's time to show the world what you're made of. Whatever happens, you're a team. You stick together, you look out for each other, and you get the job done. No matter what." "Got it." The recruits responded with a unified, "Yes, Sergeant Major." Martin felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. They were ready. The transport began its descent, and the turbulence rattled the cabin. Martin could feel the nerves creeping in, but he pushed them aside. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about them. He had done his part. He had trained them, pushed them, and prepared them. Now it was their turn to step up. As the doors of the transport opened and the recruits filed out, Martin's eyes caught sight of the battlefield below. It was vast and unforgiving, a patchwork of dry, cracked earth and distant hills. The landscape stretched for miles, with no cover in sight. The heat was palpable, the air thick with dust. The mission had been classified as high risk, and Martin could see why. This was a hostile environment, and every move would be critical. As the recruits hit the ground and spread out, Martin felt a pang of nostalgia. It reminded him of the first time he had dropped into enemy territory, the uncertainty, the adrenaline, the fear. He had been young then, just like them, full of hope and ambition, ready to prove himself. Now, as an older man, he knew better. He knew that hope and ambition would only get them so far. It was their training, their teamwork, and their ability to make split-second decisions that would carry them through. They had been tested before, but this was different. This was real. As they moved into position, Martin stayed close, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. He could see the tension in the recruits, the way they moved, the careful calculation behind every step. They were following the protocols they had learned, sticking to the plan, but there was an energy in the air that made everything feel different. Then it happened. The crack of gunfire pierced the silence. Martin dropped to the ground instinctively, his body going into survival mode. The recruits did the same, spreading out, finding cover wherever they could. The SEAL team, who had been inserted separately, made their way to their positions, providing support as the recruits prepared to engage. Martin's heart raced as he crawled to a vantage point, his rifle at the ready. The recruits were moving with precision, their training kicking in as they responded to the threat. They had come a long way since the days of their initial training. They had learned to move as a unit, to communicate silently, to trust each other. And now, that trust would be put to the test. As the firefight intensified, Martin's mind flashed back to his own experiences in combat. The feeling of being under fire, the constant awareness that danger was just a heartbeat away. But there was something different about this moment. The recruits weren't just following orders, they were leading themselves. They were thinking, adapting, making decisions in real time. They had become soldiers in the truest sense of the word. The firefight continued for what seemed like hours, but in reality, it was only minutes. Martin moved with the recruits, ensuring they stayed on mission, ensuring they kept their heads. He could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, determination. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for each other. And that was the moment when Martin knew. This mission, this moment, had forged them into a team, a family. The enemy had been pushed back, but the mission wasn't over. Martin called the recruits together, moving quickly from one to another, checking their status, ensuring they were all accounted for. Despite the chaos, despite the fear, they had done it. They had come together, trusted each other, and completed the mission. "Good job, everyone," Martin said, his voice calm and steady. "You've proven yourselves today. You've shown what it means to fight, to lead, and to stand by your brothers and sisters. This is what being a soldier is all about. Never forget that." The recruits stood in formation, their faces covered in sweat and dirt, but their eyes filled with pride. They had done it. They had faced the fire and come out stronger for it. As the dust settled and the sound of gunfire faded, Martin couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. These young men and women had risen to the occasion. They had faced their fears, their doubts, and their challenges. And they had done it together. They were no longer just recruits. They were soldiers. They were leaders, and Martin knew that they were ready for whatever came next. I apologize for the earlier confusion. I will continue the story as requested, ensuring it follows the guidelines you've provided. As the mission wrapped up and the final reports were filed, the recruits returned to base, their bodies sore, their minds sharp. The firefight had been a grueling test of their strength, their training, and their ability to work as a cohesive unit. It was a test that many had feared, but all had passed. Martin Kelly stood by the edge of the runway, watching the helicopters take off, the sky streaked with the colors of sunset. The recruits, once unsure of their place in the Navy, now stood taller, more confident in their roles. They had earned their place in the team, and Martin had been there to see them grow. But as the dust settled, he couldn't help but feel the familiar pang of bittersweet pride. It was what he had trained them for, what he had prepared them for, and now they were ready to carry on without him. It was time for him to step aside. As he turned to walk back to the base, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from General Thompson. "Sergeant Major, I've been informed that your program has been a tremendous success. The recruits have shown exceptional growth under your leadership. I'd like to discuss a new role for you. Let me know when you're free." Martin didn't need to read the rest. He knew what it meant. His time at the base had come to an end. The Navy had bigger plans for him, plans that would take him away from the recruits he had worked so hard to shape. He had always known that this day would come, but now that it was here, it felt like an abrupt end to a journey that had meant so much to him. But as he looked out over the horizon, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The work he had done here was important, but the mission was bigger than just him. The Navy was full of young men and women who were ready to take on the world, ready to lead, ready to fight. And as long as they were ready, Martin knew his job was done. Later that week, Martin met with General Thompson at the officers' quarters. The general greeted him with a firm handshake, his expression serious. "Sergeant Major," the general said, his voice deep and steady. "I've been told time and again about the impact you've had here. The recruits respect you, they look up to you. Your mentorship program has changed the way we approach training. But we have a new mission for you." Martin stood still, waiting for the general to continue. "We're sending you on a special assignment," the general said. "You've earned the right to step into a new role, one where you can have an even bigger impact. We want you to lead a task force that will help shape the future of military training across the country." Martin felt a sense of pride swell in his chest, but there was also a feeling of hesitation. He had grown attached to the recruits, to the base, to the mission that had kept him grounded for so long. But he knew this was his next step. This was the next challenge. "I'm honored, sir," Martin replied. "I'll do whatever is needed." The general nodded. "I know you will. You've always done what's needed. And now, we need you to help lead the way for the next generation of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines." The general paused before adding, "Your legacy here is undeniable, Sergeant Major. But there's more to do. The country needs you." As the meeting concluded, Martin couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. He had spent his life training soldiers, leading them through the toughest situations, but now it was time for him to take on a different role. He was no longer just a mentor. He was now a leader of leaders. The weight of the responsibility was heavy, but it was a weight he was ready to bear. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Martin met with military leaders, strategists, and trainers to discuss how to implement the new training program. The goal was clear: create a system that would ensure future generations of soldiers were not only physically prepared but mentally and emotionally equipped to lead. The work was exhausting, but Martin's dedication never wavered. As he traveled across the country, visiting military bases, conducting interviews, and reviewing training methods, he found himself energized by the mission. This was the next step in his journey, the legacy he would leave behind. As the months went on, Martin continued to push the envelope, ensuring that every soldier who came through the training program would be ready for anything. His leadership, honed through years of service, was now shaping the future of the military in ways he had never imagined. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Martin sat alone in his hotel room, reflecting on the journey he had taken. From the young recruit who had barely known how to hold a rifle to the mentor who had shaped hundreds of soldiers, to the leader now helping to transform military training across the country. He had come full circle, and yet there was more to be done. He knew that the work would never truly be finished. There would always be new soldiers to train, new challenges to face, and new missions to accomplish. But as he looked out at the city skyline, he felt a deep sense of peace. The mission was still ongoing, but he had done his part. The next generation was ready, and he had helped prepare them for the challenges ahead. He had lived the life of a soldier. Now, he was living the life of a leader. And that was a legacy he could be proud of.